Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Richard Ovenden. I am Bodies Librarian and the Helen Hamlin Director of University Libraries and Head of Gardens, Libraries and Museums here at the University of Oxford. And it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 edition of the Richard Benson Lecture in the Reproduced Image. After the lecture, which is going to take a slightly different form from the previous two, which is our distinguished lecturer is going to say a few words at the start. He and I will then be in conversation, and then we will have time for you to ask Joel some questions towards the end. At that point, you're warmly invited, ladies and gentlemen, to join us and our distinguished lecturer in Blackwell Hall for what can only be described as an adult beverage. And at that point, you're also invited to purchase some of Joel's publications, which we've made available for sale this evening. And I think he might just be persuadable to sign said purchases. But before I introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, I would like to explain a little of the background to this lecture. Richard Benson, after whom the lecture is named, was until his untimely death Dean Emeritus of the Yale Art School and a distinguished photographer, teacher, and critic. But prior to his academic career at one of the world's great institutions of higher education, he was a printer. Indeed, a master printer, responsible for printing some of the most important art books in the 20th century, from Lee Friedlander's American Monuments to Tchaikovsky and Hamburg's The Work of Auger, and towards the end of his career, Madonna's Sex. In that capacity, especially, he was a collaborator with great photographers and curators. Say that Chip Benson, as he was known to his friends and colleagues, was a man of polymathic eminence is a strong understatement of his qualities. As an example, he received the Guggenheim Fellowship not once but twice and added a MacArthur for good measure. But why is the Bodleian Library in the University of Oxford hosting an endowed lecture in honour and in memory of this great American artist and printer, someone who spent most of his academic career in New Haven? Well, there are several answers to this question. Firstly, Benson's great preoccupation was with printing photographs in the best possible way for printed publications. To put it simply, he's one of the individuals who made what we now call photo books look the way they do. He more than mastered the technique and technology of offset lithography, making it possible for thousands of people, and in the case of Madonna's Sex, millions of people, to study, appreciate, and enjoy the work of great photographers through the medium of the printed book at increasingly high levels of fidelity. His collaborations with artists such as Paul Strand and Lee Friedlander, with institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, all provide the backdrop to Benson's contribution to the photographic book. As one of the world's great libraries, with a great and growing collection of photo books, we recently celebrated the gift of Sir Charles Chadwick Healy's collection of 20th century photo books. To have this association with Richard Benson and to have the opportunity to invite scholars and practitioners to come and share their thoughts on the reproduced image should, I hope, be straightforwardly obvious as falling into the what's not to like category. Secondly, we intend through the lectures to address current concerns in the reproduced image, concerns that I know Chip was deeply interested in. And that is to say, the impact of digital technologies on the way images are created, reproduced, and received. But the most direct reason why this lecture is being held here this evening is due to the mutual friendship between Chip, Alan Chasanoff, and myself. Alan Chasanoff was another polymathic individual like Chip, with broad interests and an insatiably inquisitive mind. As a great collector of many things, but especially photography, he left great collections of photographs and photo books to institutions across America and to this institution. Alan was a friend of Chip for many decades, but also a great friend of mine and the Bodleian. Alan had many friends, but his relationship with Chip was of very great importance to him. And when Chip died, Alan wanted to honour his name and sponsored gave a donation to enable us to host this lecture in his honor. The first lecture was devoted to the life and work of Richard Benson and was given by his friends and collaborators Jock, Reynolds and Thomas Palmer. The second lecture in 2023 was given by the master printer and publisher Gerhard Steidl. This evening, we're deeply honored to welcome Joel Meyerowitz to give the 2025 edition of the Richard Benson Lecture in the Reproduced Image. Joel Meyerowitz is simply one of the greatest photographers of our times. Born in the Bronx and having trained as an artist at Ohio State University, he worked briefly as an art director in an advertising firm and gained at the same time a master's in art history. On an advertising assignment, he worked with Robert Frank, and this encounter was life-changing, and Joel's career from this point took a different path, and he began more than 5 decades of taking photographs, becoming one of the pioneers of serious photography in color. Throughout his career, Joel has produced more than 60 photo books, beginning with Cape Light in 1978, and we will be discussing 5 of them this evening, so I won't say any more about that aspect of his career. Joel's photography has been consistently pioneering, pushing the medium in new ways. He's impossible to pigeonhole as an artist. He's a master of street photography, of portraiture, of still life, of landscape, and even photojournalism. And it is this combination of qualities that has brought him innumerable accolades. He has, like Chip Benson, twice been awarded the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and has also received awards from the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities. In this country, he has received the Centenary Medal of the Royal Photographic Society. He has also exhibited very widely, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York and recently at Tate Modern, associated with his book, A Question of Color. Joel Meyerowitz is a photographic artist of astonishing power, lyricism, passion, humor, and beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, for the format of the 2025 edition Richard Benson Lecture in the Reproduced Image, he and I will be shortly in conversation, but in a second, I'm going to invite him to come and address you. But before that, please join me in giving him the warmest possible welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was lovely. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well enough? Mic, great. Good. That works. I'm going to free associate for 5 or 6 or 8 minutes, something like that, about my life as a photographer. Thank you for talking about Robert Frank and that sudden change of direction. I had been in graduate school studying art history, and I was a painter. And when I watched Robert Frank work, the immediacy, the surprise quality of the way he made photographs changed my understanding of photography, which at that time I had no understanding of at all, because I was so involved in the visual arts from a painter's perspective. And photography in the early 60s was considered sort of down there in the basement, not something that the fine arts really respected, even though there had been a great tradition of American photography. It was sort of in limbo in some way. But as soon as I saw the potential of it, and you know, potential is just your imagination, doesn't exist until you do something with it. But the potential of it struck me as a whole new way of experiencing myself in the world. Prior to that, working as an art director, I also, in the evenings and on the weekends, tried to maintain the energy to paint. But to be in a tiny little studio box, looking at a flat, two-dimensional canvas and making marks on it, after discovering the power of photography, it seemed to me to be something I didn't need to do. I wanted to be out in the three-dimensionality of the world. I wanted to walk around among people who, during my lunch hours at the advertising agency, I would be out on the street and everything seemed wondrous to me. Every glance, every connection, every gesture seemed to be loaded with potential. But I never thought about a camera and stopping them until I had seen Robert Frank work. And then the art director that I worked for after I quit my job, spending the afternoon with Robert, gave me the sense that I can't do this advertising stuff anymore. And I told my boss, and he loaned me his camera. And then a few weeks later, he gave me his French edition of The Americans, because he was leaving America to live in Spain for the rest of his life. And so the very first book I had, within a few weeks, deciding I was going to be a photographer, was this incredible document about a young photographer's journey across America. And I, in thinking about our discussion this evening, soon to be discussion, I remembered how important it was for me to turn the pages in order, not to flip from the back, to turn in order and to watch the images play upon my consciousness in a way that transformed my understanding of what photography was capable of. Trick really was, how do you go about manifesting that in the real world? How do you switch from putting paint on a flat surface to putting images on film? Also a two-dimensional surface, but one lives in a three-dimensional world. And you watch the way the street moves and lives and pulses and changes, and people weave in and out. And right from the beginning, I had this sense that I shouldn't be looking for the bullseye in a target. I should be trying to read the entirety of the street, the near and the far, the oncoming and the passing. And I understood that in order to be a street photographer, although I couldn't practice it right away, in order to be a street photographer, which I think is a really good grounding for being a more general kind of photographer, because it teaches you about timing, it teaches you about need, it teaches you about instantaneous recognition of fleeting potential of meaning. Nothing is ever certain, it seems to me. But when you're on the street and you're watching the light play and people moving and traffic going by and the season that you're in, all of these things work on your potential sensibility about what meaning might come from this, what kind of poetry, what kind of sensitivity or humor or tragedy even can you see on the streets, invisible in the overall, but when you put a frame around things, you do this, and suddenly the rest of the world is outside the frame. But it has an impact. It presses onto the frame. And so one has to work with these, what could I call them, sensory conditions that allow you to both see something that is coming towards you and becoming something of possible meaning, while the rest of the world is spinning around beside it. It's a very selective process. And if you look on any camera today, it says on this little dial, 1,000th of a second, which means that we, as normal human beings, have the capacity to sense that something is imminent, that something is manifesting itself right in front of you like a magic trick. And at 1,000th of a second, you can stop this potential and have a record of it on film, nowadays on a sensor. So that was magical to me. And you can call it magical realism in a way, because nothing is for sure. There was no sense of the definite final picture. Everything was fluid and changing. And that was an incredible place to play. And I went out every day and have been for the last 63 years, living my life outside on the street. And as Richard mentioned, over time, I've added other kinds of photographic questions to my vocabulary, because photography does have kind of endless possibility the real world, real life, real time, human beings, nature, buildings, landscapes, interiors, still lifes. All of this has been part of the history of art. But photography and working on the street was a unique way of being. To me, it seems that that was the one thing that painting did not have. Because when you look at the history of painting, most of the time, everything ends in the painting just before the frame. Only really beginning Degas, who also made photographs, that he started cutting off people on the edges. So there's one wonderful photograph of a horse's head at a racetrack coming into the frame. And it's shocking when you look at it because it seems so photographic. So I think what you'll be seeing tonight, part of the conversation that Richard and I will have, is a range of these territories that have fascinated me and have called me to enter them and to see what else there is to say about photography. So I hope you enjoy the evening, and we'll have some time for questions afterwards. Okay, thank you. No.
Hey.
All right.
So,
Shall we begin?
if we're sitting comfortably.
Yeah, Maggie always says that. It's a childhood thing.
Absolutely. So we're going to work. The idea is, folks, that we're going to work through 5 books. 4 of them are published, and one is a book that never was quite.
Never was quite. That's right.
And we're going to start at the beginning, which is a good place to start, as somebody once said.
Well, it depends on which beginning we're talking about.
Okay.
The beginning of my publishing life
Exactly.
is where Cape Light is. And that's where it started. And that, well, I started photographing in 1962, and this was published in 1978. And if I may say, I once tried to get that unpublished book published with Aperture in New York, and they held on to it for 3 years, hoping to publish it. And then finally, the editor said, no, the publisher said, you know, Joel, there's only about 1,500 people worldwide that buy serious photography books, and we can't afford to publish your book. And if Robert Frank were to come to me today with the Americans, we wouldn't be able to publish it.
Oh.
He said that. And
Was that Michael Hoffman?
It was Michael Hoffman. Yeah.
Amazing.
Amazing. And so, in a sense, you get a feeling of how little photography was cared about, at least from the book world. So finally, in 1978, after having spent 2 summers on Cape Cod with a large 8 by 10-inch wooden Deardorff camera, I made this book, Cape Light.
And what did you have an idea of what the book would be like? The kind of layout, the sequencing, all of those decisions that go into making a book when you started, or did that evolve as you worked with the book designer and Carl Zahn?
Yeah.
And you know, how did that evolve?
When I went to the Cape in 1976 for the first time with my young family, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew that I needed a more powerful descriptive tool than a 35 millimeter camera because I wanted to make big prints. And in the 1970s, nobody was making big prints. This was the size print that was sort of standard. Lee Friedlander size, Gary Winogrand, me, everybody printed about 11 by 14 inches. And I just felt using color, film was so creamy and smooth that it could go up this size without falling apart. It had no grain to it. And so I just wanted to make images that had so clear a description that I could print them large. And after a summer of work, I began to feel that there was something here that I needed to do more of. And so I went back the next summer. And during that winter, I had shown some of the pictures to the director of the sort of the graphics department of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, mostly engravings and images from that kind of perspective. And he said, "These are wonderful. I'd like to make an exhibition." And so I said, "Well, I'm doing another summer of work. How about after that?" And that's when the book decided to be published. And I made the rhythm of the pictures. Carl Zahn designed the typeface, the scale of the book. I mean, you see, it is an intimate size book, affordable. It won the best printing of the year for its quality at that time. And it looked like it was the very best printing. And then the next time it was reprinted, like 2 years later, there had been a change in the inks. These first inks were dirty inks. They were made from compositions that had earth qualities, earth materials in them. They were real inks. And then the Japanese company Toyo created a set of printer's inks that were luminous. And the second edition was spectacular, where the first edition had muddy things, even though it won best printing. The second edition was, it felt like I was looking at the photographs themselves. So this book has been through many, many printings, and over the years, it's maintained both its popularity and its printing qualities.
Should we look at some of the images in the book?
They're not in any particular order except for the first couple, because this is the very first negative I ever made with an 8x10 view camera. I rented a house in Truro, and we arrived on July 1st, and we were unpacking and everything, and finally everybody was in place. I took out the camera, and you see it upside down when you see it in the camera. And I wanted to see if I could get things straight and how do you make an exposure for it. I mean, it was my first. I bought the camera only a few months before I went to the Cape in Salt Lake City, Utah, of all places. And so this was sort of a practice picture for me. And it came out. I thought I would honor it by putting it as the first picture in the book.
Well, you say in the interview, in the front matter, you say, "I'm sensitive to colored space and the envelope of light enfolding things. I go around taking them in, passing them along, and I try not to have a hierarchy of value about these photographs." And I think actually that first image is a great representation of that idea of colored space and the envelope of light enfolding things.
We live in color and we're moving through our spaces all the time. But if you stop and you look at something deeply and you take in all of its qualities, color of the walls, the tonality of a shadow, the bounce light on the ceiling that's coming off of the floor, you begin to sense that you're in this envelope, really, that this moment, this place is full of descriptive characteristics of the light and the material that it's falling on. And so I had this sense of living in these spaces in a very different way, of experiencing them, of having a kind of true connection to it, because the 8x10 cameras, it's this big. And when you're under the dark cloth, looking at the image on the ground glass, it's a theater. Suddenly the outside world is cut off from the 360 degrees in every arc to this little 75 degree space, let's say. And every detail sings.
Well,
And
that's what it looks like to me. Definitely breathtaking. I mean, this book is breathtaking. Let's look at small pictures.
I chose to put this picture because the first one is a yellow picture, And so I thought, well, the viewer is going to be saturated with yellow. So what is the complement to yellow but blue? And I wanted the second picture to go from an interior to the vastness of an external space where the figures are incredibly small. Because a camera of that size describes things even hundreds of meters away. If you were to enlarge that, you could see the bathing suits that people are wearing, the colors of them, and the skin tones. And you know, a 35 millimeter photograph would take up this much space. This is 80 times bigger than a 35 millimeter picture. So everything that's in here, if it was a 35 millimeter, it would be just mush in some way. And so I felt, wow, the power of this camera to give me human scale, the materiality of the landscape, and the vastness of the sky is a way of making people experience it as if I had stepped aside and you could look at the photograph as if you were there. That was the sense I had. It was a transformative moment.
Joel, I'm going to quote yourself back at you right here now, because you say again in the front matter here, I'm trying to photograph the wholeness of my experience. I'm trying to pass that experience back into the world.
Very different from the kind of street photography I did before, which was sort of, you know, sinuous and moving, and there was no time to really stop and take it all in. I was moving through it. It was more like jazz in its kind of free form, whereas the large format view camera is a cello. You know, this is you know,
The piccolo.
a little piccolo, a trumpet or something, you know, something that's in your hands. And that view camera gave me a kind of volume, an experience that I was feeling it all. I was taking the time in a more meditative way.
And so did you really kind of feel that slowness that you were being, by the format of the camera, being forced to slow down? And that was a pleasurable thing compared to the streets of Manhattan?
Well, yeah, it became a pleasurable thing. It took me a little while to put on the brakes because I'm so used to quick, quick, quick. And in fact, I think that speed of decision making on the street was an asset for me, because if I had started with a view camera and then decided I wanted to switch to a small camera in the street, I don't think I would have had the same kind of chops. You know, in this way, I had an instant response to a place, to the significance, the potential of a place, but I could slow myself down. Because all of these exposures, I mean, take a look at this. These exposures, even in bright sunlight, were always a half a second or more. And a picture like this was probably 3 seconds or 4 seconds at f/90. I had the lens on my camera reduced from f/64 to f/90 so that I could have as much depth of fields so that I could photograph something 8 feet away and infinity. I wanted it all in the frame. I wanted the pressure, the descriptive power to be the pressure that you would feel so that it would feel real to you, not like something was out of focus there. Because we all seem to think we're seeing in focus all the time because we are ranging our focus. Wherever we look, we're focusing. And so I wanted the camera to pass that along.
Just one question for you here, a sort of moment of reflection, because 1978 is a moment when photography is changing from being predominantly black and white to the kind of primacy of color, or kind of serious photography, and certainly serious photographic books. And I see you with Stephen Shaw and William Eggleston as the pioneers of that movement. And did that did you get that sense at the time? And when the book was published, did you feel that people thought it was, you know, that departure from the black and white world, and the black and white world which you were very much associated with, Friedlander and Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus?
I think that by the 70s, by the mid 70s, color had a little bit more acceptance, particularly when a number of us started making books, and the books were out there and the books were engaging in whatever ways they were. People began to feel like, oh yeah, color, sure. But it wasn't that way in the beginning. I started in color with Tony Ray Jones, who was an English photographer. He was living in New York City, and we bumped into each other at a lab. Actually, when I developed my first 2 rolls of film, 1962, I took them to a local lab just off Fifth Avenue, and I came back the next day, and I got my 2 rolls of film, and I was looking at them on a light box, and the bearded long-haired guy, and next to me is another bearded long-haired guy, and he's looking at his pictures, and we then began to look at each other's pictures. And he was also an art director, working for Columbia Records, of all things. And we started to share, and it seemed like color was a natural thing for both of us. We didn't have any sense that we had to be shooting in black and white. But in the subsequent couple of years, every time we showed our pictures, people would say, well, why are you shooting color? You know, black and white is real photography. This stuff is you know, commercial, is amateur. And we didn't feel that way at all. I'll tell you, when I shot this first few pictures on Cape Cod, 1976, on the second week, I flew to New York and I processed the first 50 or 60 negatives and went into my darkroom and contact printed them. And the first thing I did was take 2 of them to a lab and make 40-inch prints. So they were meter across. And I rolled them up, and I took some of the 8x10s and I went up to the Museum of Modern Art to see John Sharkovsky. And I brought these pictures along. John was in his office on the phone. John was a photographer himself using a large format camera, so he would, I thought, understand. And he came out of his office, and I had these 2 40-inch prints pinned to the wooden cabinets in his office. In those days, you could go into a museum without having to, you know, hand your stuff in. You just walk in, go upstairs, go into the offices. It's crazy when you think about it. And John came out, and I remember him going like that, and he took his pipe out of his mouth, and he turned to me and he said in his Minnesota accent, "Why so big?" And then I whipped out the little 8x10s, which were like this. You know, they were jewels in terms of how they radiated their content. And then he sat and he looked at those and he said, I understand. He said, but I really prefer they pull you in. And at that time, of course, he had received the gift of all the Atches. And you know, he had been
the idea of the contact prints and that sort of maximum fidelity of the imagery on the paper from the negative was strong.
No interpretation and no
loss.
Scale and everything. So, you know, I continued, but I think by the mid 70s, momentum that we were bringing to it, and also television had turned from black and white into color in the 70s.
That's a very good point.
And so suddenly people were more used to seeing imagery in color and feeling the pleasure of it.
Joel, I'm conscious we've got 4 more books. We should look through some more.
Okay, so here comes a little bit of entertainment.
But they're just
yes, good.
sensational.
Oh yes, oh my God, we have to move along. So in the beginning, I made lots of pictures in the evening because the camera made long exposures. So making exposures that were many seconds long allowed me to look into the darkness and to have a kind of, a feeling of what the glow, what the atmosphere was.
And can I just, so for this image, was this something that you were kind of, were you waiting for a moment here?
Oh, no.
Or was this just...
Mid-afternoon, a storm came, and when you're Cape Cod is a peninsula 60 miles out into the Atlantic. So when a storm comes, it's just moving along, and it became black during the afternoon. I took the camera outside because I saw how beautiful the lights were coming onto the deck. And I set it up, and it was quite a long exposure. And as luck would have it, boom, that lightning bolt fell, and it just fell perfectly into that little space. So I had nothing to do with it. I mean, another afternoon storm that passes, and these are just moments, and it's things like this is like almost street photography like. Of course, the organization of the lifeguard stand and the flapping of the flag and the linearity of the horizon, that's all a kind of part of the texture of it. But those kids, moving in and out of the frame was part of the excitement. It was the unexpected characteristic, which, I think I gravitate to.
And here you've got that movement with the long exposure time.
Exactly. And this was one of the very first portraits I ever made with a view camera, because she was so different from everybody else. She was young, she felt out of place, she was, all by herself, even in amidst the crowd, and she was beautiful. And I've known her ever since. Really, quite a long time. And so a few times in that first summer, I made portraits just by chance. And then I discovered that people would see me with this big wooden camera and were curious about why I was using this old-fashioned thing under a dark cloth. And so they would approach me and talk, ask why. And I began to look at people and think, my God, look how beautiful a person is. They don't have to be pretty beautiful, but beautiful, humanly beautiful. I mean, skin color, clothing, the way it fits, the marks, the tropical fish that this redhead reminded me of. And so I began to ask the question, what's a portrait? Who's it of? How do you go about it? Without having a studio, but to do a plein air photograph, one frame only, not to make a big deal out of repeated images. And living on the Cape, living right on the water, offered me another observation, which was atmosphere, the elements, basically, air and water. What's it like to live on the water and to study the phenomena of light over water? So the experience on the Cape actually built over a number of years. So even though Cape Light has some of these qualities in it, it took me a while to see that they were qualities worth pursuing in depth. Even in a picture like this, you can see there's a horizon on one part of the picture and not on the other, because the part this side is an atmosphere that happens at the end of the day when the water, the chill of the water is now creating a kind of condensation in the atmosphere as the heat of the day is vaporized, literally vaporized. And it was such a bloom of light that it obliterated the horizon. And I ran inside to get the camera, came back out. I had less than 30 seconds and it was gone. The temperature had changed just to the right point, and all the moisture just fell to the sea. So kind of street understanding of time and the necessity of time and acting quickly produced this image.
Okay. We need to pause. That was such a kind of incredible, intense sort of experience of transport. You transported us to Cape Cod, Joel, and now you've moved us further west.
Yes, this is St. Louis, and
well, I think this was your second book, and I
Yeah.
think you didn't seem to suffer from the second album problem that many artists have, because this is a firecracker of a book, and an extraordinary one because of that sort of unifying theme through the images that are laid out in the book.
Well, actually, I had gone to St. Louis to do some research on the book Bystander, The History of Street Photography. My co-author, Colin Westerbeck, was from St. Louis, and I had a job to shoot something there. And I said, why don't you come with me and we'll go to some of the library sources in St. Louis and look at old photographs. And while we were there, a childhood friend of Colin's was the director of photography at the university in St. Louis, and friends with the director of the museum, who was from Cape Cod. And I brought a few of my pictures. I didn't know I was going to meet him, but I always carried a few of these pictures in case it would be an opportunity to show the work. And when he looked at these few pictures, this was in 1976 when I went there. So I was working on this, and then I went there to do the research, and he said, could you do this in St. Louis? And I said, well, I was walking around downtown all day today, and the center of the city was hollowed out. The arch had been built, but they had destroyed much of the waterfront and some of the interior of the city. So the city was very engaging. You could sort of see through the missing teeth of the city, because blocks were just missing things. You could look like that. And so I said, I really had the feeling I could work, and I would like to do something with the view camera in a city. So he raised some money, and he invited me to come. And so simultaneously, I was working on these two projects, and they were very different, because the city is a different creature than the landscape. And let me show you a few of the pictures. I discovered that I could make panoramic views with the view camera by turning the film on its side and making 1, 2, 3, in this case 4 images using the horizon line as a link, so that I could expand the space. I mean, when I first printed this, it was 10 feet long, a real print, a paper print, 10 feet long and 3 inches tall. And it really gave me a sense of what the scale and scope of the arch was. And my task was to make as many pictures of the arch from different vantage points in St. Louis, so that I could make this book, St. Louis and the Arch. And it was a real adventure. It took me a whole year, going back and forth in each season for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and really connecting to the city, discovering the arch. Well, it was like a game, find the arch.
Where's Wally? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it serves, and I felt that there was a learning curve, and something special happened, which I'd like to just share for a moment. With the small camera, you're in this jazz moment where you're improvising and making pictures and just moving through. But carrying a view camera around is a much slower feeling, experience. And in St. Louis, I had, for the first time in my working experience, a sense of the call I would walk into a block like this street, and something about the proportions and the light and the weight of the shadows and everything in it. People weren't there when I had that. I set up the camera, make a picture of a space that registered to me for no clear reason I could identify except a totality. It's as if I stepped into a space and it was the right space. A few feet back, it wasn't. A few feet further on, it wasn't, but this was the right space. And as I was setting up the camera, this couple came into the picture and for whatever reason stopped in their conversation and had what I think must have been an argument. I couldn't have positioned them better if I was the director, because they were next to this same size shadow on the wall. And I thought, oh my God, I got the film out. I shoved it and I made the picture. But I was stopped by the presence, some force. And I thought, this is an important consideration, that one has to allow an inexplicable force to take charge, because it's one's sensory apparatus operating on an intake of energies, dynamics, proportion, scale, color. All of these things are vibrating in some indefinable way, but strong enough to give you the call. And if you don't pay attention, you lose out on trusting something that's deeper than just your mental signal.
Yeah. Well, and if we could go back to the book itself, it's the same format as this. It's designed by Carl Zahn again.
Yep, I asked him to do it, even though it was for a different museum.
Okay, but there was innovation because you had fold-outs.
Yeah, that's right. There were fold-outs.
And was that because was that a response to the panoramic experimentation that you were doing?
I wanted the viewers who were looking at St. Louis to suddenly have an experience of seeing how the scale of the city would affect them after they had been seeing page after page of this. But there was something else about doing this book. I edited this book on Cape Cod a year or so later, and I always make a small maquette. I make dummies of the book with real size pictures, but I also make maquettes of small images that I move around so I could find the rhythm of the book. And I did that book to Schubert's Quintet in C. I played it 100 times, I'm sure, over and over and over. We're going to wrap this up in 10 minutes. This is actually a 2-hour talk we're going to have. And I know you're going to be comfortable. You won't get hungry or anything.
I'm up for it.
Okay. Well, we'll see how as long as we're interesting. Anyway, over and over, I was trying to find some way, some form, musical form of having a repetition of an image, the arch in various scales. And I wanted to see if I could use a musical notation to making a book. And I love doing it. I went into a kind of blissful state of creating it. And then the book was done, it went out in the world, and that was that. And then a year later, I get a letter from a woman in California, and she said, "Dear Mr. Meyerowitz, I have your St. Louis book. And I can't explain this, but every time I look at the book, I hear music." One person.
We've got to power through.
We're going to power
Let's
through.
look at some more pictures of St. Louis.
You see, I mean, sometimes it's just a simple space that calls out for rendering, because even in big cities, in American big cities, it's almost as if there was a neutron bomb that went off and left the city intact, but there were no people left. And that was an experience I had regularly in not only St. Louis, but in other cities. And sometimes you play with an arch, a different kind of arch. And that's actually a transplant center. It's not a diner. You just go in for a transplant. 25 cents, it's a deal.
Okay.
So this is a jump backwards in time. In 1966, I made some money in an advertising job and I ran away for a year with my wife then, Vivian, and we traveled around Europe for a year. And here you can see we landed in Southampton. You'll recognize it up there. And I got a car. I picked up a Volvo that I bought in New York and picked up in Primrose Hill. $1,400 in 1966 for a car. Imagine that. I drove that car 20,000 kilometers around Europe and across into France and then down through France and into Spain. I lived in Spain for 6 months with gypsies, with flamenco gypsies, and then traveled up after traveling around in Spain, up back through France, spent 6 weeks in Paris. I had intended to go to Russia, but we ate well in Paris and we ate Russia in Paris. So we went through the middle of Europe and all the way through Eastern Europe and into Turkey and all the way through Turkey, up the middle, and then back through over to Greece, and then to Italy, and then back to America. And it was one of those transformative years. I was 28 years old. My first time away from New York City in the old world. I was away from Gary Winogrand, who was my daily buddy. We were out every day for almost 5 years, and Todd Papageorge. And I was on my own, and it was magical. And I saw things in a different way, and I was learning the vocabulary of foreign cultures and how to interpret meaning in places that I didn't really know the systems. In some places, the language. I could understand English. I also had for many years photographed while I was driving. And throughout the European trip, I photographed thousands of times out the window while I was driving. This is in London. And, I don't stop. I just drive and I shoot. The camera was in my lap. It was set at 1,000th of a second at 15 feet to infinity. And I just made these pictures because in the car, the front window is like you're in the camera. You're actually driving the camera in a way. And so it seemed to, and dragons as well. This is Wales, I believe. So I did that. And when I went back to New York, I showed John Charkovsky 100 pictures from the car, and he gave me a show immediately. He said, "Oh, let's make an exhibition. No one's ever done this before. This is the first conceptual work of photography." That's what he said. So you'll see pictures of from the car throughout this work here.
And did the process of making this book, which was very recently, 2024,
Yeah.
did that, was that were you transported back to that period? Was there you must have had a huge array of images to scale down to the format of the book that you produced? Was that a fun or was that hard?
It was thrilling. It was really thrilling. I had 750 rolls of film, half color, half black and white, which I shot in that year. And of course, I processed them all and made many prints over the years, but there were many pictures that never made it onto the paper, color and black and white, color in particular. So this was an opportunity to really look deeply at who I was at 28 years of age, and what kind of pictures did I make? Because I photographed for an entire year without ever seeing a picture. So I had to photograph on faith that they were all going to come out because I couldn't, process and print while I was traveling. So I just had to believe that my exposures were going to be good and go on and on and on. So when I got back to New York, I had a marathon few months of processing all the color and then processing by myself all the black and white, making contact sheets, making prints. But it was an opportunity for someone in his 80s to look at the version that was 28 to see if there was a through line between the me then, who was searching and yearning, because I had only been photographing for 4 years, not even 3.5 years when I went to Europe. So I was still a beginner, but were my instincts aligned with who I am today? How did this work in relationship? So the show at the Picasso Museum in Malaga was 202 prints and divided into the countries. This is a Chartres cathedral, and John saw this. He said, "Oh yeah, the last necessary picture of Chartres."
And was it, is this an urban legend, or is it true that you, in going on the trip, you decide you if you'd stayed, you might have been part of the New Document show with Arbus, Friedlander, and
I was the fourth photographer. And John told me, now this shows you how either stupid you can be when you're young, or how much your own life is more important than something like an exhibition. John had selected from 100 prints that I gave him a body of work, and I was the fourth person. I was the youngest by 10 years for the other three, but he wanted to include me in the show. And I said, I'm going to live in Europe, and I don't think I could come back. You know, I'm renting our apartment, and I want to be in Europe. I said, so please, you know, forgive me, but I'm going to Europe.
Well, we were the lucky ones.
And maybe that's why he gave me the show when I came back, was to make up for what I walked away from. But you know what? I never gave it a second thought.
Yeah.
It's just, that's life. That's the way it
And
is.
you created this amazing body of work.
Yeah, I had a chance to be out in the world on my own and to play in the world of chance and risk. You know? I mean, one of the things that I learned very early on was a saying of Louis Pasteur, which was, chance favors the prepared mind. And I thought, what a great photographic motto to have on your t-shirt. Because if you have the camera in your hand and the camera is cocked and ready to go and there's no lens cap on, and you know, you're looking, you're prepared for anything, which is also a kind of Japanese Zen swordsman motto, which is expect nothing, be prepared for anything. And photography is that too. Those two phrases were guides, like spiritual guides to looking at the world and being ready to deal with the unexpected whenever it made itself known. Because there's humor in things. I mean, you know, they got to have their cafe and their newspaper and their cigarette. Doesn't matter what, where they are, they got to have it. And they're so nonchalant, blasé.
The world carries on.
Yeah, the world carries on.
Just the energy, you know, the angles, the dynamism, the energy, just distilled for a second there.
One picture only. And it pays to be a curious person. I was just on the street probably going to American Express, where you used to be able to pick up your mail. I had a poste restante there. So I was walking to American Express and I see this crowd in the corner, and I just moved quickly. And as I got to a crowd where I pushed my way through a little bit, this moment happened. This man with a hammer is stepping over this fallen man at that precise moment that I got there. And made this picture, and he just disappeared. But no one stepped in to help the fallen man. I was astonished because in New York, when people fall off the bus and trip on the street, I mean, I've seen it. I've been there. I've picked them up. I've helped them. I dusted them all. But nobody in Paris, nobody did anything.
We've got to speed up, Joel.
I'm going to go fast. So
we-
this is from the book, A Question of Color, which was the Tate Museum show, which I carried two cameras, black and white and color, so that I could try to make an argument for color by showing these possibilities. And I made hundreds of these pairs so that I could understand which one I preferred, which one did the job of giving you the most information. We're entering Spain, as you can see. This is the time of Franco, being a young American living in a dictatorship, just like today. I could feel the presence of what, the police and the clergy and the army and the Guardia Civil. You were surrounded by these people who had total control over your life. I just wanted to say one thing. Look at what color can do. This is a piece of color film. It gives you all the information in the shadows, as well as all the information in the highlights. It's beautiful. It's a remarkable instrument. And I wanted to express the fullness of life's mysteries in color because I thought there was just so much to look at. And I was passionate about it.
That passion, then your kind of insatiable desire to record is luminous through these images.
I began to challenge myself to start to move the frame around so that I made many things happen in the frame at the same time, rather than a singular thing in the center. I was pushing myself, even then, for that. Well, these are the gypsies that we lived with. 19 people in 4 small rooms. And the man on the left was a very famous maestro of the flamenco guitar, Antonio Escalona, and famous, really famous all around Spain, and his son, Pablo. Pedro. Color. Timing, rhythm. All of us in this little space. Joyous moment near around Christmas time. This is leaving Europe, leaving from Naples, 1967. I buy Europe, back to America. And this is the unpublished book called Still Going, which I believe Thames and Hudson has promised they're going to publish after the next 2 books are done. I have to finish those first. But I call this Still Going because when I came back to America after a year in this world, I saw America in a very different way. And I saw that it was taking a knee, that it was in a state of decline. I recognized it in some visceral and intellectual way that something was wrong. That it was now like 20 years after World War II. The generation that fought was now retiring. Retirement communities were building all over the country. America was in Vietnam. It was for the wrong reasons. It was losing the war. The country seemed to me to be falling apart. And in America, if you have a car and it's a junker, and someone says, "How's that car of yours?" They say, "It's still going," which means a piece of shit, but I can't get rid of it. And that's what I thought America was. It was still going. And I got a Guggenheim grant twice to go around America a couple of times, photographing this decay and change that I saw, how it was falling apart. And to show some of the protests that were going on at the time, and to show, I don't know if I have that picture in here, but I noticed that whereas there used to be statues in almost every little town of World War I doughboys, saving the world on a plinth someplace, just like in Lee Friedlander's Monuments book that Richard did, I noticed that they were being replaced, and jet planes, $1 million jet planes that were junk, were being put on pedestals in circle roundabouts or in playgrounds, or rockets were being placed, at crossroads in places, because they couldn't store them anywhere. So they just were giving them to the public to look like ship launch. The anchor is made out of flowers. I think that was pretty good. It took from the car. It took me a couple of years of driving around. Always go to Scotty's Drive-In for my milkshake. And we protect our cars in America. We don't want anything like atmosphere to touch the car. So everybody has a little private bubble for their car. And then when they christened that ship, Santa Claus was lowered in the basket from the ship so that he could witness the launch of this huge gift that we were that we were going to send immediately to Vietnam.
The new normal.
But miracles happen. If you pay attention, you could be wherever a miracle happens in any form whatsoever. I went into some art director's office looking for a job, and I thought, oh, is that his escape when he finally has had enough? He goes out the window.
Wings of desire.
Their child is going to need therapy. I know it. So that picture, this picture marks the turning point in my 35 millimeter work just prior to doing this book. So these are in like 74, 5, and 6. I started to try to empty the frame of an image in the center. I wanted to see if I could make an overall image. And that desire to make everything meaningful rather than having an incident, like the woman on crutches with dancing in front of the two shoes. I wanted to see if I could make these overall images in a way that would give the viewer, because I was thinking big, give the viewer a sense of everything in the space. And that's what pushed me to picking up the 8x10 camera. So for me, it was a transformation to go from the small camera with everything to the big camera with everything.
Okay.
So now we're entering the last, this is the most, well, in this show, it's the most recent book. It was made in 2005. I spent 9 months inside Ground Zero, photographing with the large format camera, with the Leica, with a 6x9 centimeter camera, 6x7 centimeter camera, and a video camera. I was loaded for bear. I was in there for 9 months. I was all on my own. I couldn't bring anybody in.
And reading your preface or the text at the start of the book, that is quite interesting because there's a link back to Cape Cod.
Yeah, there is.
And you write that in the summer of 2001, you were preparing for an exhibition of photographs in New York from the studio walls in Cape Cod, were covered with 4-foot tall work prints, creating a massive cityscape in the tiny space. And the last of those images was taken on the evening of September the 5th. That included a shot of the towers.
Yeah, it was from this perspective. This was my studio. I had this unobstructed view of Lower Manhattan. And over the years, I made numerous photographs of that space because it was like a landscape. That faraway range was like a mountain range. And the weather, because we're on the Atlantic, the weather that would happen in the background was totally various. Snowstorms, thunderstorms, hurricanes, everything, including boring, empty sky day like that last one. And I had strips, like if you took the center out, I had 4-foot tall prints for a show that was going to be in September, mid-September in New York City. And then the event happened. And Maggie and I were up on Cape Cod, and we couldn't get back because they closed New York City. And so 5 or 6 days later, we came back, and I immediately went down to Ground Zero, and they had fenced it in so you couldn't get in. And I had wanted to be of service, and I didn't know what I could do. And I thought, I can make photographs. Nobody was doing it because Mayor Giuliani said no photography allowed. He didn't want people to monetize the disaster and that, show gruesome pictures of people's remains. And so he banned all photography. And I thought, screw you, Giuliani. We need this record. This is, the First Amendment. And I don't care. I'm going in. And so I figured out how to beat the system. And I did. I got in. And I stayed for 9 months and made 8,500 photographs of everything from the very beginning till when it was an empty hole in the ground, from a pile to a basement, basically. And there's just a few pictures here, some portraits. This is Eddie, who managed to, I don't know how he did it, but he just got out of Sing Sing prison. And the next day he had a job inside Ground Zero working on these machines. And he was actually, you wouldn't want to mess with him, but you'd also like to have him behind you if you needed assistance. And I said, Eddie, how'd you get this job? He said, family. I'm a member of the family. That's it. So he was something.
And this book is quite different from your others. Obviously, the subject matter is sui generis, but they're full bleeds. It's a big, large format book. It's heavy. And the images are shocking, striking, and the kind of developments in offset since then were such that the images have a kind of an incredible power because of the innovations in printing. And is this the book that has had the widest circulation? Have you printed more of this than any of your other books?
Sadly to say, the only book of its kind. I was the only one in there for all that time. The book weighs 8.5 pounds. The manager of the bookstore inside the museum, I worked with the museum curators and director on helping organize things for exhibitions within the museum. My work is exposed in the museum. When it came time to selling this book, the guy refused to have it in the bookshop because he said it was too heavy for people to carry away. And I said, never heard of shipping? I mean, today, everybody ships everything. You order a pencil online, it comes to you in a box. So, really? And so they've never sold the book in there. He sells pamphlets of 16 pages that show, I mean, no pictures of the inside, but stuff that is meaningless. And no matter how many times I've discussed it with the director of the museum, the head curator of the museum, they all want the book. The bookstore owner is a separate entity, and they refuse to do it. They said, oh, it's too heavy, too heavy. So they missed out on thousands and thousands and thousands of sales. And I missed out on all the royalties. Not that you get that much anyway, but it's a piece of history that is as significant as that doesn't exist is just heartbreaking to me. And I try every year. I always call up somebody there and say, did this guy, you fire him yet?
Well, it's a remarkable photo book. I mean, obviously, it's an astonishing tragedy. And your documentation of that sort of heroic, but massive task to reclaim the city is an absolutely astonishing record of a absolutely transformative moment in the city's history and in both American and world history as well.
Yeah, it's a defining moment for sure. And you know, it was conflicting for me too. I have to say it was emotionally charged because I was in there with, you know, thousands of bodies, basically, and all that rubble and everything. And yet there were days like that day there. It's one of those October days where the sunlight is brilliant. You feel it on the back of your neck. It's warm. You feel good to be alive. And then I think, I'm standing here in a cemetery with thousands of dead people. What right do I have to feel good about the day? And to navigate this, the fact that there were beautiful, transcendent, sublime moments. I mean, this was a description of the sublime, actually. All of it, the monumentality of it, the cascade of debris and the piles. It was like seeing a mountain range, you know. And I finally came to terms with it, and I thought, well, this is a record of time passing. And here we are, next year, 25 years have passed since this happened, and it's getting further and further away. It's smaller and smaller, and people have been born that were not alive then, and those people who were children are adults now. And so I felt that it was my duty to be as sensitive to everything I saw as I could be, to be a fully human documentarian. I mean, I never did what would be called, well, this isn't photojournalism per se. It's like historical photography, I think, because I wasn't selling it to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are, we're down at the bottom. They've taken away the rubble. And these men and women are scraping the rubble with rakes, looking for a bone, a tooth, a belt buckle, something that might have a little bit of DNA for one last identification of somebody. And they found them. They found those bits and pieces there. And this, which is the last picture of our show, is after the site was closed in July. It was closed in May. I went back in July and walked around, and I found this little patch of grass growing under a railroad tie. And I realized that those seeds had fallen 40 years before when they were first building this place, and they had dug it out. They laid the railroad tracks and everything, and then they built the buildings over it. And those seeds had lain dormant there for all that time. And finally, they were exposed again. Sunlight and moisture. They sprouted. I thought, perfect ending for the book and for our talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joel Meyerowitz.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.